Jonathan Caldwell stood in his Manhattan office, the city skyline stretching out before him in a dazzling display of wealth and power. From this vantage point, he ruled an empire, one built on sharp business acumen, ruthless strategy, and an unyielding pursuit of success. But tonight, as the golden glow of the setting sun reflected off the glass towers, his mind was not on the next big deal or a multimillion-dollar acquisition. Instead, he was focused on something far more personal. His wedding. Jonathan had meticulously planned every detail of the event, ensuring that it would be nothing short of spectacular. Olivia Harrington, his bride-to-be, was everything a man like him could want: poised, elegant, and, most importantly, an asset. Their union would merge two of the wealthiest families in New York, solidifying their dominance in high society. The wedding wasn't just about love, it was about power, influence, and securing a future where no one could challenge his position. But there was one more detail, a final touch to make the event truly unforgettable. An invitation. Not just any invitation, but one sent to Clare Bennett, the woman who had walked away from him 8 years ago. The woman who had left without a word, vanishing as if she had never existed. The woman who had once made him believe in something as foolish as love. Jonathan smirked as he traced the embossed gold lettering of her name on the envelope. He had spent years burying the pain of her betrayal, convincing himself that she had been nothing more than a mistake, a lesson in weakness that he would never repeat. And now, he would have the satisfaction of showing her just how far he had come, how untouchable he had become. "You're really doing this?" Jonathan glanced up as his younger sister, Victoria, sauntered into his office, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. She held a glass of wine, her expression one of amusement. "Yes," he replied, leaning back in his chair. Victoria studied him for a moment, her smirk mirroring his own. "You do realize she won't come, right?" She disappeared, Jonathan. Poof. Gone like she never existed. "She'll come," he said with quiet certainty. Clare never could resist the chance to prove a point. Victoria raised a perfectly shaped brow. "And what exactly is the point of this? Revenge?" Jonathan swirled the bourbon in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "Call it closure." His sister laughed, shaking her head. "Closure, please. You don't want closure, you want her to walk into that ballroom and see that you're untouchable now. You want her to regret leaving you." He didn't deny it. He had spent years rebuilding himself after Clare left, turning heartbreak into ambition, anger into success. Now, he had everything: wealth, status, and a future with a woman who was perfect on paper. But there was still a part of him, buried deep beneath the layers of control and calculation, that wanted to see Clare's face when she realized what she had lost. Victoria smirked. "Well, if you want to rub your success in her face, I won't stop you. Just don't expect her to crawl back." Jonathan chuckled. "She won't. And I wouldn't want her to." But even as he said the words, a tightness settled in his chest, one he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet town far removed from the glittering world of Manhattan, Clare Bennett stood frozen in the doorway of her modest home, an unopened black envelope trembling in her hands. The scent of freshly baked cookies still lingered in the air, mixing with the soft hum of jazz playing from the old radio. Just moments ago, the evening had been peaceful, filled with the gentle laughter of two little girls. But now, everything had changed. Her fingers tightened around the invitation, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. Jonathan's wedding. For 8 years, she had built a life away from him, away from the world they once shared. She had told herself it was for the best, that leaving had been the only choice. But now, As she stared at his name in elegant script, the past came rushing back, the whispered promises, the late nights wrapped in his arms, the devastating words that had shattered everything. "Mommy?" Claire snapped out of her thoughts as two identical sets of brown eyes peered up at her. Ava and Emma, her 7-year-old daughters, stood in the doorway, their gazes shifting between her and the letter in her hands. "What's that?" Ava asked, pointing at the envelope. Claire hesitated before forcing a smile. "Just an invitation." "To what?" Emma pressed, tilting her head. Claire exhaled, her grip tightening. She had spent years keeping their father a secret, unsure of when or how to tell them the truth. But now, it seemed fate had made the decision for her. She knelt in front of them, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. "It's an invitation to a wedding." The girls exchanged a glance before Ava frowned. "Are we going?" Claire bit her lip. She had promised herself she would never step foot in Jonathan's world again. But could she really keep the truth from her daughters forever? "Maybe," she said softly. Ava's face lit up. "Can we wear fancy dresses?" Despite herself, Claire chuckled, kissing her daughter's forehead. "We'll see." As the girls ran off giggling, Claire's smile faded. She turned the invitation over in her hands, her stomach twisting. Jonathan wasn't expecting this. He wasn't expecting them. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel as she drove through the bustling streets of Manhattan, her heart pounding harder with each passing mile. It had been 8 years since she last set foot in this city, and yet, nothing about it had changed. The towering skyscrapers, the blinding lights, the never-ending energy pulsing through the air. It was the same Manhattan she had once called home. But she wasn't the same. She was no longer the naive young woman who had believed in fairy tale endings. She was a mother now. A protector. And she had returned for one reason only, to face the man who had unknowingly fathered her daughters. In the back seat, Ava and Emma were buzzing with excitement, their little voices filling the car. This was their first time in New York, and the sheer size and movement of the city fascinated them. "Mommy, look at that building. It's so tall," Ava exclaimed, pressing her face against the window. Emma, the more observant of the two, tilted her head. "You seem nervous." Claire forced a smile. "It's just been a long time since I've been here." That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The truth was far more complicated than she was ready to explain. The black envelope with Jonathan's name had changed everything. She had spent days debating whether to throw it away or acknowledge what it represented. For 8 years, she had told herself she was doing the right thing, raising her daughters away from his world, away from the man who had once broken her heart. But could she really keep them from him forever? She had tried to tell him once. Back when she first found out she was pregnant, she had picked up the phone, dialed his number with shaking hands. No answer. She had left messages, first hopeful, then desperate. Still nothing. When that failed, she had written him a letter, pouring her heart onto the pages, begging him to hear her out. But it had gone unanswered, as if she had ceased to exist in his world. Eventually, she had forced herself to accept the painful truth. Jonathan had erased her. And so, she had done the only thing she could, she had left. Now, as she pulled up in front of the Grand Hotel listed on the invitation, her stomach twisted. Jonathan had spared no expense, of course. The entrance was lined with luxury cars, the chandeliers inside casting golden light onto the marble floors. It was a world of wealth and power, one she had once been a part of but had long since abandoned. She turned to the girls, smoothing their hair before leading them inside. The lobby smelled of expensive perfume, and every detail screamed of excess. She checked in quickly, avoiding lingering glances, and took them up to their room. The moment they stepped inside, Ava and Emma ran to the window, their faces lighting up as they gazed at the city below. "Mommy, everything looks so small from up here," Ava marveled. Claire smiled softly but said nothing. Her mind was elsewhere. "Mommy?" She turned to see Emma watching her carefully. "Are we really here to see an old friend?" Claire hesitated, her throat tightening. She had always known this day would come, the day when she would have to explain. She just hadn't expected it to be now. Taking a deep breath, she reached for her purse, pulling out the invitation. She handed it to them, watching as their small hands turned it over curiously. "This," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is an invitation to a wedding. A man named Jonathan Caldwell is getting married." The name meant nothing to them. Why would it? Emma frowned. "Why do we care about his wedding?" Claire swallowed hard. "Because he's your father." The room fell into complete silence. Ava blinked. "Our father?" Claire nodded, her heart aching. "Yes." Emma's small brows furrowed. "But we don't have a father." Claire closed her eyes briefly before meeting their innocent gazes. "You do. You always have. I never told him about you." Ava's lower lip trembled. "Why?" Claire wanted to tell them everything, that she had tried, that she had never wanted to keep them from their father. But how could she explain something so complicated to children? "Because I thought it was the best thing for you," she whispered. "I didn't think he wanted us. I didn't think he wanted me." Emma crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. "And now?" Claire hesitated. "Now, I think he deserves to know the truth." The silence stretched between them, thick with emotions too big for such small hearts. Finally, Ava reached for her hand. "Are we going to meet him?" Claire nodded. "Yes." Emma still looked skeptical, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned back to the window, lost in thought. Claire exhaled shakily. This was happening. There was no turning back now. That night, as the city buzzed outside, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, she would see Jonathan for the first time in 8 years. Tomorrow, he would learn the truth. She didn't know how he would react, if he would be furious, if he would accuse her of lying, of keeping his children from him on purpose. But one thing was certain. Tomorrow, everything would change. Jonathan Caldwell stood near the entrance of the grand ballroom, greeting guests with a firm handshake and a polite smile. The air buzzed with the quiet hum of wealth and influence, the city's elite dressed in their finest, sipping champagne beneath glittering chandeliers. This was exactly how he had envisioned it. Perfect. Controlled. Until Claire Bennett walked in. For a moment, Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The deep blue dress she wore hugged her frame with quiet elegance, her chestnut hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She looked composed, poised, like a woman who belonged in this world but had chosen to leave it behind. But it wasn't just Claire that turned his world upside down. It was the 2 little girls standing beside her. The ballroom seemed to shrink around him, the polished conversations of his guests fading into a dull hum. Jonathan's eyes locked onto the identical dark curls, the delicate features that mirrored his own so perfectly it made his stomach tighten. His daughters. His mind reeled. The resemblance was undeniable. The sharp curve of their cheekbones, the deep brown of their eyes, features passed down through generations of the Caldwell family. And yet, He had never seen them before. A murmur rippled through the crowd as more guests took notice. His fiancée, Olivia Harrington, stiffened beside him, her manicured nails tightening around his arm. Jonathan barely registered her reaction. His entire world had narrowed to 3 people across the room. Clare met his gaze, her expression unreadable. No smugness, no apology, just quiet resolve. She had expected this moment. He hadn't. With long, measured strides, he crossed the room, closing the space between them. The girls clung to Clare's hands, their young eyes wide with curiosity. Jonathan stopped mere inches away, his voice low and sharp. "What the hell is this?" Clare's fingers curled slightly at her sides, but her voice remained steady. "This," she said evenly, "is what you should have known about a long time ago." Jonathan's pulse pounded in his ears. The accusation, the weight of those words, they cut deeper than he was prepared for. He turned his gaze back to the children. "They're mine," he said, barely above a whisper. Clare inhaled slowly. "Yes." The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. 8 years. He had lost 8 years of their lives. Before he could respond, a small voice interrupted the storm brewing between them. "Mommy?" Jonathan barely had time to process the word before one of the girls, Ava or Emma, he didn't know yet, looked up at Clare, her voice cautious. "Who is he?" Jonathan felt something inside him snap. His daughters didn't even know his name. Clare turned to the girls, her voice softer now. "This is Jonathan," she said gently. "Your father." Ava's tiny shoulders stiffened. "Our father?" Jonathan swallowed hard. "Yes," Clare confirmed. The other girl, Emma, he thought, crossed her arms, her face a mirror of suspicion. "Then why weren't you here before?" The simple, innocent question cut deeper than any accusation ever could. Jonathan opened his mouth, but no words came. He had no answer. No excuse. The murmurs in the ballroom grew louder, whispers swirling like a rising tide. Olivia's grip on his arm tightened, her voice sharp. "Jonathan," she hissed, trying to regain his attention. "What is going on?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Olivia turned her glare on Clare. "Who the hell are they?" Clare met Olivia's hostility with unwavering calm. "His daughters." The room fell into stunned silence. Gasps, hushed voices, everyone had heard the words. There was no taking them back. Olivia's expression darkened. "Daughters," she repeated, her voice eerily controlled. "You're telling me that on the night of our wedding, this woman walks in and announces that you have 2 children?" Clare remained unfazed. "I didn't come here for you, Olivia. I came here for them." Jonathan finally forced himself to speak. His voice was cold, controlled. "We need to talk," he said, his gaze locked on Clare. She nodded. "Yes, we do." The weight of the moment was suffocating. The perfect wedding, the carefully curated evening, it had all crumbled in an instant. Jonathan barely noticed Olivia's outrage, barely registered the guests whispering about the scandal unfolding before their eyes. Because none of it mattered. Not the wedding. Not the empire he had built. Only them. Ava and Emma. His daughters. Jonathan paced inside the dimly lit hotel suite, his hands clenched into fists. Hours ago, he had stood in a ballroom filled with New York's elite, ready to celebrate his wedding to Olivia Harrington. Now, he was here, staring at the woman he had spent years trying to forget, Clare Bennett, and demanding answers about the 2 little girls who had turned his world upside down. Across the room, Clare stood near the window, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. The city lights cast a soft glow on her face, but Jonathan could see the tension in her posture. "I need to understand," he said, his voice rough with barely contained frustration. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire exhaled sharply. "I tried." Jonathan let out a bitter laugh. "No, Claire. Trying means calling, writing." "I did," she cut him off, her voice steady but edged with pain. "I called. I left messages. I wrote you a letter explaining everything. And I never heard back." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "That's impossible." Claire met his eyes, unwavering. "Is it?" The accusation hung between them like a heavy fog. Jonathan shook his head. "I would have never ignored something like that." "And yet, you did," Claire said quietly. He took a slow step closer. "You expect me to believe that for 8 years, you tried, and I just, what? Ignored you? Pretended you didn't exist?" She lifted her chin. "Yes." Jonathan's breath came fast and sharp. It didn't make sense. Claire had left, walked out of his life without an explanation. He had spent years believing she had abandoned him, only to find out that she had been carrying his children. His gaze flickered to the adjoining bedroom door, where his daughters, were sleeping, completely unaware of the storm brewing outside. Jonathan swallowed hard. "What else aren't you telling me?" Claire hesitated, just for a moment, and he saw it, something deeper, something unspoken lingering in her expression. But then she squared her shoulders. "It doesn't matter now." "The hell it doesn't," Jonathan snapped. "You kept my children from me, Claire. You stole years from me." Claire's eyes darkened. "I did what I had to do." A dangerous silence stretched between them. Jonathan's fists clenched. "I want a DNA test." Claire inhaled sharply. "Jonathan." "No," he interrupted. "I don't care how much they look like me. I want proof." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Fine." The room felt suffocating, the weight of their shared past pressing down on them both. Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "If they're mine." "They are," Claire said firmly. His chest tightened. "Then we figure this out." Claire swallowed, her voice softer now. "Okay." Jonathan turned toward the door, needing space, needing air. But before he left, he glanced back at her one last time. The truth had shattered everything. Now, he had to decide what to do with it. Jonathan sat in his office, the results of the DNA test spread out before him. The stark black and white text left no room for doubt. Ava and Emma were his daughters. The truth that had unraveled over the past few days now sat heavy on his chest, suffocating. 8 years. He had missed 8 years of their lives. First words, first steps, scraped knees, bedtime stories, all of it had been stolen from him. And Claire had been the one to keep it from him. Except, she hadn't. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had spent years resenting Claire, believing she had abandoned him, but now the story wasn't as simple as he once thought. Victoria, his own sister, had orchestrated everything. She had intercepted calls, blocked letters, made sure that Claire disappeared from his life entirely. He clenched his fists. He had trusted Victoria, had let her influence every major decision in his life. And in doing so, he had let his own children grow up without him. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Patrick, his longtime friend and attorney, stepped in hesitantly. "Jonathan, the press is starting to catch wind of this." Jonathan scoffed. Of course they are. Patrick sighed, running a hand over his face. We can get ahead of it, but you need to decide what you're going to do next. Jonathan knew exactly what he needed to do. Later that evening, he stood outside Claire's hotel room, his pulse unsteady. He had spent years making decisions with unwavering confidence, but now, standing here, he felt like a man with no solid ground beneath him. He knocked. Claire opened the door, her expression wary. Jonathan. I want to see them. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. Inside, the room was dimly lit. Ava and Emma sat on the bed, their coloring books spread out before them. At the sound of the door, they both looked up, their big brown eyes filled with curiosity and hesitation. Jonathan cleared his throat. Hey, girls. Ava shifted slightly. Emma stayed quiet. Claire crouched beside them, her voice gentle. Do you remember what we talked about? About your dad? Ava nodded slowly, glancing up at Jonathan. You're him? Jonathan swallowed hard. Yeah. I am. Silence stretched between them. Jonathan wasn't sure what he had expected. Hugs? Excitement? He had seen countless movies where a long-lost father reunited with his children, but nothing had prepared him for this moment, for the quiet uncertainty in their faces. Ava studied him with a seriousness far beyond her years. Where were you? The question cut deeper than he expected. He took a slow breath. I didn't know about you. Emma frowned. But Mommy did. She did, Jonathan admitted. And she tried to tell me. But I didn't get her messages. Ava tilted her head. Why not? Jonathan hesitated, searching for a way to explain years of deception to a child. Because someone didn't want me to know. Emma's lips pressed together. That's not fair. No, Jonathan agreed softly. It's not. Ava looked down at her coloring book, tracing the edges of a drawing with her finger. So what happens now? Jonathan crouched down, leveling himself with them. I'd like to get to know you. If you'll let me. Emma glanced at Ava. Maybe. Jonathan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Claire, watching from the doorway, finally spoke. It's going to take time, Jonathan. He looked at her, really looked at her. I'm not going anywhere, he said. And for the first time in years, he meant it. Jonathan sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The city stretched before him, lights twinkling like stars against the dark sky. It had always made him feel powerful, untouchable. But tonight, it only made him feel empty. His daughters barely knew him. Claire didn't trust him. And the person responsible for all of it, Victoria, was still out there, waiting for her next move. The past few weeks had shaken everything Jonathan thought he knew. He had spent years believing that Claire had walked away from him, only to learn that his own sister had manipulated him, cutting off every attempt Claire had made to reach him. The rage simmered inside him, cold and controlled. Victoria had stolen years from him. She had played God with his life. And now, she was going to pay. The next morning, Jonathan stormed into Caldwell Industries, his presence turning heads as he made his way to the executive floor. He wasn't here for business. He was here to end an era. Victoria sat behind her massive mahogany desk, dressed impeccably as always, her expression calm as she swirled a glass of wine. Jonathan, dear brother, she greeted smoothly. To what do I owe the pleasure? He tossed a folder onto her desk, watching as her eyes flicked to it, then back to him. You intercepted Claire's letters. blocked her calls. Had her followed, Jonathan said, his voice low and dangerous. And you threatened her. Victoria let out a soft sigh, as if you were a petulant child throwing a tantrum. I protected you. Jonathan clenched his fists. You destroyed me. Victoria smirked. And yet, look how much you thrived. You built an empire, Jonathan. You became the man you were meant to be. Jonathan took a slow step forward. You stole my family from me. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Victoria's face, hesitation, perhaps. But it was gone in an instant. Get out, he said, his voice like steel. Victoria arched a brow. Excuse me? Jonathan leaned in, his tone quieter now, but no less lethal. You're fired. She laughed, a short, sharp sound. You can't be serious. Jonathan didn't blink. You think I'd let you stay after what you've done? The board has already approved it. As of today, you're out. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, her jaw tightening. Then, slowly, she stood, adjusting the buttons on her designer blazer. You think this is over? She asked, her voice laced with amusement. Jonathan held her gaze. I know it is. Victoria smiled, a cold, calculating smile. You always did underestimate me, Jonathan. She walked past him, her heels clicking against the marble floor. As the door closed behind her, Jonathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. She was gone. But he knew Victoria. This wasn't the last he'd hear from her. Later that evening, Jonathan found himself standing outside Clare's home. It was smaller than the luxury penthouses he was used to, but it felt warm, real. He could hear laughter from inside, his daughters, playing. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, taking a deep breath, he knocked. Clare opened the door, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. Jonathan. I needed to see you, he said simply. She studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. Come in. Inside, Ava and Emma were sitting on the floor, a puzzle spread out between them. They looked up as he entered, their expressions cautious but curious. Hey, girls, Jonathan said, crouching beside them. Ava hesitated, then pointed to the puzzle. We're stuck. Jonathan smiled. Maybe I can help. Emma studied him carefully before sliding a piece toward him. Jonathan fitted into place. For the first time, Emma smiled. Clare, watching from the doorway, crossed her arms but said nothing. Jonathan looked up at her, his voice softer now. I don't know what this means for us, Clare. But I know I want to be here. For them. And for you. Clare swallowed, her walls still up, but something in her eyes softened. You have a lot to prove, Jonathan, she said quietly. He nodded. I know. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Life has a way of unraveling the truths we once believed, forcing us to face the past with new eyes. Jonathan Caldwell spent years thinking he had been abandoned, only to realize that deception had stolen what mattered most, his family. His journey teaches us that holding on to resentment can blind us to reality, and sometimes, the people we trust the most may not have our best interests at heart. For those who have lived through love, loss, and regret, this story is a reminder that it is never too late to seek the truth, to mend relationships, and to fight for what truly matters. Time is precious, but it is not an enemy, it is an opportunity. Whether it's reconnecting with family, making peace with the past, or simply choosing to listen before judging, the lesson is clear. Love requires effort, honesty, and sometimes, the courage to begin again. No matter how many years have passed, the most meaningful things in life, love, family, and forgiveness, are always worth fighting for.